these international bankers that were behind this movement. And ladies and gentlemen, not behind this movement alone. They were behind the other fascist movements that took place in Germany of that era, in Italy of that era. The same international bankers that funded the geopolitical machinations occurring all over Europe and Asia in that window of time, not the least of which that led to the overthrow and to the unfolding of historical events in the Soviet Union. And your host wishes that we had hours in which to continue this exposition, but I would refer you to the work of authors like Jim Marrs, like Joseph P. Farrell, who have made a very thorough exposition of the details, the twists, the turns of events, the historical figures involved, the windows of timing, that point in tremendous authority and detail toward who was behind these machinations, and in fact it was the international bankers. Returning back to Smedley Butler, why is it that these folks did not deem it expedient to move forward with their plot? It's because they got what they wanted. And in this same window of time, in this early tenure of FDR's office, you will note that is the time of the Emergency Banking Act of 1934. Please make a note of that. Please do your own research. The Emergency Banking Act is when they closed all of the banks, what they called the bank holiday. No one was allowed to make withdrawals from their accounts. All holdings of gold among the American populace were confiscated by your government at that time. That's correct, confiscated. You were forced to turn in your holdings of gold, and if you did not, you were subject to the Trading with the Enemies Act. You were considered an enemy of the United States if you tried to withhold any of your gold holdings. This is the window of time when the Federal Reserve Bank took full authority, took full control. This is not made in the historical record, but this is the window in time when your United States government entered bankruptcy, in which it has remained to this day. And why don't you know this? Why didn't you hear this in history? Because the U.S. bankruptcy is considered a matter of national security. National security. It always returns to that, doesn't it? And the trouble with national security is that it is a precious few, and sometimes in the hands of just one individual, who is allowed to make this determination that you don't get to know because they think they know what's best for you. And that is what is wrong, folks, with America. Now, classification, national security, compartmentalization of information. Your humble host wishes to provide you with more examples of the power of compartmentalization. Let's turn our attention, for example, to the presidency of Give 'em Hell Harry Truman. Harry Truman, of course, was vice president under FDR, whom we just talked about, but not vice president for FDR's entire tenure. No, that was Henry Wallace for the first couple of terms of FDR's administrations. It was only FDR's final administration that Harry Truman was named to be his vice president on that ticket. And in fact, Truman had been vice president for only 82 days when President Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945. And folks, President Roosevelt was known to be in failing health for years prior to his death, but in particular in the window of months leading up to his death, his health was known to be in dire consequence. And so what I'm about to inform you about Harry Truman and about the power of compartmentalized information should resonate with you. It should give you some scale and scope of understanding about how NASA and these lies and cover-ups about extraterrestrial life, about the right functioning of our solar system, of our cosmos, of our galaxy, about so many of these other elements that they keep bound is in how it's made possible, how the truth has not made it to our ears. You see, shortly after taking the oath of office, Truman said in his first remarks to reporters, and I quote, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellas ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Now, President Truman there is not referring to hearing the news that President Roosevelt had died. What he's referring to are the briefings that he received when he had finally attained the level of classified information to be made aware of what was really happening and had been happening all around him. Part of that was the Manhattan Project. Those of you who are not familiar with the Manhattan Project, That's the title given to our course of research and development and testing leading up to the implementation, the deployment of the atomic weapons. The Manhattan Project is believed to have involved a scale of more than 130,000 people in its development. And so we're talking about senior military officials, we're talking about experts in their fields of physics, of the sciences that were employed. We're also talking about the blue-collar folks who constructed the facilities and the factories that were required for this project. The blue-collar folks who worked on the assembly lines and did the die casting and all of the other elements that were needed. Entire towns, villages were constructed for all of these people who were involved in the development of the Manhattan Project. The scope of the facilities involved ranged from Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, over, it's believed, into Arkansas and Alabama. Folks, we're talking about a tremendous scale of people involved in this project, and yet it is also believed that perhaps fewer than 20 people of that more than 130,000 had awareness of what the actual objective, the ultimate outcome was to be. All of the others had their heads down and were focused on their individual pieces of this puzzle, and due to the magic and the wonder of compartmentalization, the ultimate truth was held in the hands of very few. And how few? Ladies and gentlemen, maybe you don't realize that even the President of the United States does not sit at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the totem pole of access to classified information. No, the President of the United States himself sits midway in the pyramid, midway on the totem pole. If that doesn't chill you quite enough, then the idea of how it is that Harry Truman, Vice President of the United States, one heartbeat away from becoming president at any moment, when all of the folks surrounding the administration knew that FDR's health was dire, that he was not long for the world, so to speak. Despite all of that, the determination was not made to brief, to allow Truman any knowledge whatsoever of the Manhattan Project. That's right, one heartbeat away from the president, and yet deemed not of a need to know, even in some of the basics of the elements of the Manhattan Project and its consequence. Folks, that is the power of compartmentalization. That is the power of slapping the label national security on something. And ladies and gentlemen, those people who have that power to do so, that can make that determination, sometimes in the hands of one single individual, as we watched President Nixon attempt to do, an attempt to sweep away the Watergate scandal by using that exact same technique and tactic, by calling it national security. Fortunately for the American people, at least in that window of time, members of Congress and the Supreme Court said, no. No, you will not be allowed to do that, sir. No, you do not have the power to do that, sir. And yet, as fortunate as we are that it was not allowed to happen in that window, ladies and gentlemen, it has been allowed to happen in so many of these other events that impact us in such a tremendous way. Another example, the Tuskegee experiments. If you were with us on the show a couple of weeks ago, you heard Dr. Stanley Monteith on the program as we talked about the Tuskegee experiments, as in Tuskegee, Alabama. Tuskegee, if you're not familiar. That was a scientific research program conducted between 1932 and 1972 in Tuskegee, Alabama, in which 400 syphilis-infected black men were recruited by the United States Public Health Service. These participants were all told that they would be treated for their infections, but instead of being treated for their illness, all medicines were withheld. The black men were then actively prevented from obtaining treatment elsewhere, as their bodies and the bodies of their wives and children were systematically ravaged by disease. The United States Public Health recruited these subjects of the study, and the research program itself was conducted by medical doctors at hospitals, involving university staff, and also involving the tacit knowledge and awareness of, as troubling as it is to believe, members of law enforcement who were recruited to help in this process of actively preventing them from obtaining treatment elsewhere. Yeah, it's difficult to contemplate, folks, that this type of systematic and calculated evil takes place, and yet it does. The Tuskegee experiment is just one other example for you to follow. You can take a look at Project MKUltra. You can take a look at columns of Army personnel, our dedicated servicemen, who were marched headlong into sites of radiation detonation and testing. Why? So that the effects of radiation on the human anatomy could be studied. And these folks were maintained as lab rats and studied through the course of multiple decades so that your military could see not just how the radiation affected them personally, but yes, you guessed it, how that radiation then went on to affect their offspring and their children's offspring. It is not easy to look at these subjects, ladies and gentlemen, but as we turn our attention back to Comet Elenin and Elenin's friends that are on their way, and so many of these other things that NASA has awareness of, and yet they only feed us the scraps from the table and give us these tiny bits of meta-disclosure, it is important to set the stage with that level of calculated evil that is easily kept in the dark and veiled from your eyes by virtue of compartmentalization of information, of classification of information, that disgusting label that I wish I could get the two words out of my head and lexicon, national security. It's important for you to understand just how powerful, how sweepingly dangerous it is to allow these people to sit at the top of that pyramid without us, the people, casting the light of day on their acts and on their behaviors and on their agendas.